She gave birth in the dark, on a dirt floor, with a strip of burlap between her teeth so no one would hear her. Hours later, still bleeding, she walked into a Kentucky blizzard with 2 newborn girls bound to her chest. Behind her, 6 men, 8 hounds, and the most feared slave catcher in Mason County. And still, he couldn't catch her. But that isn't the part people whisper about. They whisper about what happened after. Because 24 hours after she reached free soil, Evelyn Harper turned around and went back for the man who owned her. December 1843, 12 miles south of the Ohio River, the Calhoun tobacco plantation lay under a winter that arrived without apology. Fields bare, frost fixed to the ground, trees along the fence line like black bone against a gray sky. Silence and order, at least from the road. Inside, the place ran on something else entirely. Silas Calhoun was in his late 40s, wealthy, respected, and proud of one fact he repeated like scripture. He had never lost an enslaved person to escape. Not once in 20 years. He wore that record like proof of virtue. Evelyn had worked inside his house for 6 years. 29. Lean, sharp-eyed, hands rough from the invisible labor that made Calhoun's life feel effortless. Cooking, laundering, scrubbing, serving, disappearing. She learned early that visibility was danger, so she moved with practiced stillness. Eyes lowered at the right moments. Words small. People saw submission. Because submission is what they expected. What Calhoun never saw was the mind behind those downcast eyes. Evelyn knew which guard drank himself useless by 10. She knew the north fence gap during the patrol change. She knew the third stair creaked, so you stepped over it. She knew which floorboard in Calhoun's study loosened if you pressed near the nail head. 2 years ago, while cleaning, she lifted that board and found the strongbox hidden underneath. She replaced it without a sound, and kept the secret like a blade under her tongue. Most people ran on impulse, one unbearable morning, then vanished into a world they didn't know. Hunted by men who knew every road. Evelyn was different. She had been planning. Supplies hidden behind the kitchen woodpile. Flint and steel. A water skin. A small knife swapped out months ago. And a sharp-smelling mixture an old woman taught her. Fat, red pepper, turpentine. Meant to confuse hounds. She'd never tested it. She would have to trust it. She didn't need bravery. She needed a reason. On the evening of December 8th, she was washing dishes when Calhoun's voice drifted through the wall. Calm, businesslike, speaking to his bookkeeper about a sale. He had already signed the papers. A buyer in Natchez, Mississippi. And the goods were to be taken at sunrise. The morning after they were born. Evelyn's daughters. Twins she hadn't even named yet. She stood at the wash basin, plate in her hands, water numbing her fingers. In the dining room, Calhoun's fork tapped china. Small, ordinary sounds of a man finishing supper, while he decided what her children were worth. Evelyn set the plate down without breaking it. She dried her hands on her apron. Slowly, completely. Then she went back to work. Because the first weapon she ever learned was control. And for the next 3 days, she would need to look like nothing had changed, while everything inside her narrowed into one silent decision. Alone. For the next 3 days, Evelyn Harper performed the most dangerous role of her life. Normal. She woke before dawn and cooked Silas Calhoun's breakfast, the same way she had for 6 years. Salt pork in the pan, cornbread warming by the stove, black coffee poured before the man even asked for it. Her hands never trembled. Calhoun barely looked at her. Why would he? To him, Evelyn was part of the house itself. Like the table. or the stove, or the quiet machinery of service that made his world comfortable. Invisible things are easy to ignore, and that blindness was the only reason she still had time. What nobody saw was what happened in the spaces between. 10 minutes each morning she carried firewood from the pile behind the kitchen. 10 minutes no one watched closely. Piece by piece, she collected what she had hidden there over months. Dried meat wrapped in cloth, a water skin, flint and steel, the small knife she had replaced back in August when the original one went missing. And finally, the vial. Animal fat mixed with crushed red pepper and turpentine. A harsh, bitter smell strong enough to sting the eyes. An old woman named Iris had taught her the trick 2 years earlier, before Iris was sold south and disappeared like so many others. Dogs follow the cleanest scent, Iris had told her quietly. So give them something they can't understand. Evelyn had never tested the mixture. She prayed she wouldn't need to. On the second day, she finished the map. She drew it slowly, carefully. Late at night by the weak light of a single candle. Roads heading east toward Virginia. Creek crossings marked clearly. 2 small towns circled in charcoal. The kind of desperate route any frightened runaway might choose. She folded it twice, then unfolded it again, crumpling the edges until it looked used. By morning it rested at her waist, tucked just visible enough that anyone searching her would find it quickly. It was meant to be found, because the map was a lie. Her real route lived nowhere except inside her head. North, 12 miles, straight north, to the Ohio River. She had memorized every foot of that distance during 2 years of watching the land from the tobacco barn window on sleepless nights. The open ground past the northern fence. The creek bend 4 miles out. The narrow stand of oak trees where the plantation boundary faded into farmland. And finally, the reeds along the riverbank, where once, months earlier, she had seen a broken flatboat half buried in mud. 2 things mattered more than everything else. The Eastern Guard drank himself useless by 10, and the patrol gap at the north fence lasted exactly 4 minutes during the rotation change. 4 minutes, with no one watching. 4 minutes was enough. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, winter clouds rolled low over the plantation. The air smelled like snow. Evelyn was stacking firewood when Samuel found her. Samuel had lived on the plantation longer than anyone else. 60 years old, gray at the temples, his back bent from decades of labor that had slowly carved itself into his bones. He handed her an extra piece of wood without speaking. He often did that, just stood beside her for a moment, sharing the small comfort of quiet company. In 6 years on the plantation, it was the closest thing Evelyn had known to kindness. She almost told him. The words rose into her chest, sharp and urgent. Tonight, north fence, come with me. But if Samuel knew, and they caught him, that knowledge would cost him everything. So she swallowed the words. Silence was the only protection she could give him. She carried the wood inside, and said nothing. That night, December 11th, 1843, Evelyn lay down on the dirt floor of her cabin for the last time. Cold pressed up through the ground into her spine. Through the crack in the wall, the stars burned faint and distant above the frozen fields. One star sat just slightly brighter than the rest. North. She had followed that star in her mind 100 times. Tonight, she would follow it for real. The rope was hidden beneath the blanket. Her supplies waited in a small bundle beside the door. And the key she had pressed into wax 6 months earlier, the key no one knew she had copied, rested in her palm. Everything was ready. Everything except the one thing she could not control. Just after midnight, the first pain came. Evelyn grabbed the strip of burlap she had prepared and bit down hard enough to taste blood. She made no sound, because if anyone heard her, the bell would ring at 5, and when it did, either she would be gone, or her daughters would be. The first child came just after midnight. Evelyn lay on her back on the frozen dirt floor, burlap clenched between her teeth, both hands pressed into the ground, as her body did something enormous, in absolute silence. No midwife, no candle, no one who knew, and no one who would come, even if they did. Pain came in waves that bent her spine and blurred the edges of the dark room, but she held it inside her chest the way she had held everything else for years. The world outside that cabin had already decided what these children were worth before they had taken a single breath. She refused to let that world hear them arrive. The first girl slid into her shaking hands a few minutes past midnight. Evelyn bit through the burlap. Blood filled her mouth. Her own lip caught between her teeth, but still she made no sound. She worked by touch alone, hands steady because they had to be. There was no room here for fear, or weakness, or hesitation. Only motion, only survival. 40 minutes later, the second child came. Smaller, quieter. For one terrible moment, there was no sound at all. Everything inside Evelyn froze. Then the girl drew a thin breath and let out a fragile cry that seemed far too small to belong to something so important. Evelyn pulled her close immediately, pressing the child against her bare chest, sharing what little warmth her body could give. Both girls breathing, both girls alive. Evelyn allowed herself exactly 2 minutes. 2 minutes lying there in the dark, listening to the tiny breaths rising and falling against her skin. Then she sat up, because time had already started moving again. She named them before she wrapped them. They needed names before they needed anything else. The first girl, the one who arrived fighting, she named Grace. Not because the world had ever shown her any, but because the child would need it. The second, smaller, quieter, she named Ruth, a woman in the Bible who followed someone she loved into a country that did not want her, and survived anyway. Grace Harper, Ruth Harper, born December 11th, 1843, on a dirt floor in Mason County, Kentucky, inside a cabin belonging to a man who had already sold them. Evelyn worked quickly after that. She bound both girls against her chest with long strips of cloth she had prepared days earlier. Skin to skin, her warmth the only warmth they would have. She wrapped her shawl over them twice, tight enough to hold them steady while she moved. Then she uncorked the vial. The smell was immediate, sharp, bitter, animal fat, red pepper, turpentine. She rubbed it into her sleeves, her shawl, her neck, every inch of clothing she wore, until the smell burned her eyes and filled the cabin. If the dogs came, she needed their noses to fail. She gathered the rest of her supplies: knife, waterskin, flint and steel, dried meat, the false map tucked carefully at her waist. For a moment, she looked around the cabin. 6 years of nights lived inside that one small room. The crack in the wall where she watched the stars, the single blanket, the dark stain on the floor where her daughters had just been born. She did not look long. Then she stepped outside and closed the door behind her. The plantation at midnight was frost and shadow. The distant orange glow of the overseer's fire burned low on the eastern side of the fields. Evelyn moved slowly across the yard, placing each step with care. Not fast. Fast makes noise. Instead, she moved the way water moves, finding the quietest path forward. Most runaways ran straight for the tree line. The woods meant cover. The woods meant hiding, which is exactly why the hunters searched there first. Evelyn walked into the open fields instead. Dead tobacco rows stretched flat and pale under the winter sky, offering nowhere to hide and nowhere to rest. Anyone watching would see her instantly, but no one was watching, because in a December night like this, no one expects a woman carrying newborn children to walk through open ground. She crossed the northern fence exactly at 10:15, 4 minutes, just as she had memorized. By the time the plantation bell rang at 5 in the morning, Evelyn Harper was already 4 miles north. Both daughters alive, both daughters breathing against her chest. The Ohio River was still 8 miles away, and the worst part of the journey had not even begun. By the time the gray light of morning began to thin the darkness, Evelyn Harper had been walking for hours, 8 miles through frozen fields and muddy creek beds, her body still bleeding from childbirth, her legs trembling from exhaustion she no longer had time to feel. Grace and Ruth were pressed tight against her chest beneath the shawl, their small breaths warm against her skin, the only warmth in a world that had turned bitter and cold. Ahead of her, the Ohio River. Freedom was supposed to begin there. Instead, the river looked like another enemy. The water ran black beneath a sky the color of iron. Sheets of ice stretched out from both banks, thick enough to break a fall, but not strong enough to hold a body. Between them, dark current churned fast and cold, carrying broken pieces of ice downstream like drifting knives. Evelyn stood at the edge of the bank and looked at it for 10 seconds. 10 seconds was all she could spare. She had planned for a river. She had not planned for this river. Swimming was impossible. The ice would break under her weight in 3 steps. And if she hesitated much longer, daylight would make the decision for her. Then she saw it. Downstream in the reeds, half buried in frozen mud, a flatboat, or what remained of one. The bow wedged into the bank, one side split and sagging, a single plank hanging loose along the edge. It was barely a boat, barely anything at all, but it was the only thing the river offered. Evelyn didn't waste another second. She stepped into the water. The cold hit her legs like a hammer, stealing the air from her lungs and locking her muscles in a wave of shock that almost forced her to her knees. She grabbed the edge of the flatboat and dragged it free of the ice. Then she climbed inside. The boat sank immediately. Water rushed over the sides and pooled around her feet. She pushed off anyway. The current seized the boat the moment it cleared the ice shelf, spinning it sideways and pulling it downstream. Evelyn grabbed the loose plank and shoved it into the black water, forcing the bow back toward the far bank. Her arms burned. Then the burning faded into something deeper, a numb, distant pain that belonged to a body already past its limits. The river did not care. Water climbed from her ankles to her knees, then to her thighs. The boat was filling faster than she could move it. But the Ohio bank was closer now. Still far, but closer. Halfway across, Grace began to cry. The sound was thin and desperate, carrying easily across the empty river. Evelyn's whole body went rigid. She pulled Grace free from the bindings with one arm and pressed the child tightly against her chest, muffling the cry beneath her coat. The other arm kept pushing the plank into the water. One arm rowing, one arm holding a newborn. The boat filled higher. Cold water climbed to her waist. The bow dipped lower. The current dragged her east, away from the bank she was trying to reach. Ruth stayed silent. Grace slowly quieted against her chest. Evelyn kept moving. The boat gave up 10 feet from shore, the bow slipped under the surface and the entire flatboat rolled sideways, dumping her into the river. The cold erased every breath from her lungs. For one terrifying moment, there was only darkness and water. Then her feet found the bottom. She forced herself upright. Both girls lifted above the river with arms that had nothing left but stubborn will. The current clawed at her skirt. The cold stopped feeling like cold at all. It became something else entirely. Pressure, weight, resistance. One step, then another. The Ohio bank rose in front of her, closer now, close enough to touch.
Evelyn collapsed onto the frozen mud on her knees. She crawled 3 feet into the reeds, and fell forward, face down, unable to stand. For a long moment she lay there without moving. Grace breathing. Ruth breathing. That was enough. That was everything. Gray morning light spread slowly across the river. And for the first time in 29 years, Evelyn Harper lay on free soil. Footsteps moved through the reeds nearby. Careful. Slow. A man's voice spoke quietly. "Can you hear me?" Evelyn opened her eyes. The man crouching beside her was broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, and calm in the way only someone familiar with danger could be. His name was Isaiah Freeman. He took one look at Evelyn, the 2 newborn girls, the frozen river behind her, and understood the entire story in seconds. "I've got you," he said quietly. "Don't try to stand." He lifted all 3 of them at once and carried them toward a small wooden storage shed hidden behind the riverbank. Inside, a fire was already burning in a small iron stove. Warm cloth waited in a wooden chest beside it. Isaiah wrapped Grace and Ruth first, drying them carefully before placing them close to the fire. Then he handed Evelyn a cup of warm water and a piece of cornbread. Only after she had eaten did he ask the question, "How many are coming after you?" Evelyn told him everything. The plantation, Silas Calhoun, the sale papers, the river, and the slave catcher who would already be on her trail. Isaiah listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "They'll lose the dogs at the river," he said, "but the men won't stop." He glanced toward the sleeping infants. "Stay here today. Tonight we move north." Evelyn looked at her daughters for a long moment. Grace's tiny fingers rested open against the blanket. Ruth's small fist pressed against her cheek. Alive. Both of them alive. "All right," Evelyn whispered. Within minutes, exhaustion took her. Not the shallow sleep of someone listening for danger. This was deeper. The kind of sleep a body claims when it has reached the end of everything it can give. For 3 hours, Evelyn Harper slept on free soil. Grace and Ruth breathing beside her. The stove crackling softly. The frozen river outside, finally behind her. It was the only peace she would get. Because, when she woke, Isaiah Freeman was standing in the doorway. And the look on his face told her something had gone very wrong. Isaiah Freeman stood in the doorway of the shed with the cold morning light behind him. He didn't speak right away. Evelyn knew something was wrong before a single word left his mouth. 6 years inside Silas Calhoun's house had taught her how to read faces the way farmers read the sky. And the look on Isaiah's face was the look of a man carrying news he wished he didn't have. "Calhoun came out this morning," he said quietly. "He found your cabin empty." Evelyn didn't move. Isaiah continued. "He went straight for the oldest man on the place, Samuel." The name landed heavily in the small room. "Calhoun chained him to the post by the barn gate," Isaiah said. "No coat, no blanket, no food, out in the cold." He paused before finishing. "He told everyone on that plantation, loud enough so nobody could pretend not to hear, that Samuel stays there. Every day you're free. He's already been there one night." Silence filled the shed. The fire popped softly in the stove. Grace shifted in her blanket. Ruth let out a quiet breath in her sleep. Evelyn sat still for several seconds. Then she stood. She reached for her coat. Isaiah watched her carefully. "If you go back," he said calmly, "you'll die." Evelyn pulled the coat over her shoulders. "Samuel will die slower," she said, "and he'll know I left him there." 3 miles upstream from the main crossing, Evelyn stepped into the river again. The water was just as cold, just as merciless. But this time, her arms were empty. Grace and Ruth remained behind in Isaiah's shed, wrapped in wool and sleeping beside the fire. Evelyn moved sideways through the current, facing upstream, one careful step at a time across the rocky riverbed. By late afternoon, she climbed onto the Kentucky bank once more, and disappeared into the trees.
Her body had no business still working. It worked anyway. The Calhoun plantation appeared out of the darkness just after nightfall. Evelyn reached the back fence and paused. Across the open yard, she saw the post. Samuel hung from it, his head lowered, his body barely moving in the freezing air. Alive, she slipped over the fence. The knife sawed through the chain's weak link on the fourth attempt. The metal snapped. Samuel's arms dropped forward, and he caught himself in the frozen dirt. Evelyn pressed dried meat and the water skin into his hands. "Tobacco barn," she whispered close to his ear. "Stay there until morning." Samuel grabbed her wrist. He didn't ask where she had been. He didn't ask why she had come back. 6 years was long enough to know the answer already. "Be careful, girl," he murmured. Evelyn waited until he reached the barn door. Only then did she turn toward the house. The front door opened without a sound. Inside, the hallway was dark and familiar. She stepped over the third stair that creaked. 11 paces down the corridor. The guard slept heavily in the parlor chair, exactly where she knew he would be. Evelyn moved past him without slowing. The study door opened easily. The loose floorboard lifted. Inside the strongbox were the things she had come for. The plantation deed. The bill of sale for Grace and Ruth, already signed. And beneath them, the financial ledger. Page after page of transactions Silas Calhoun had spent years hiding. Bribes, illegal slave trades, money moving through names that would collapse his reputation overnight if the county ever saw it. Evelyn wrapped the papers tightly in oilcloth. Then she placed one last thing on the center of Calhoun's desk. The torn strip of burlap she had bitten through the night her daughters were born. A reminder, a message, a warning. When she turned toward the door, Silas Calhoun was standing there holding a candle. For a moment he only stared. Confusion, then rage, then something colder. He stepped toward the bookshelf where his pistol rested. Evelyn reached it first. She lifted the weapon calmly, not aiming it. She didn't need to. The documents in her arms were far more dangerous than any gun. "Your secrets go to the courthouse," she said quietly. Calhoun's face turned pale. Evelyn lowered the pistol and set it back on the shelf. Then she walked past him, down the hallway, past the sleeping guard, out the front door, and into the night. At 3 in the morning, she stepped out of the river once more. The documents pressed against her chest beneath her coat. Isaiah was waiting on the bank. He said nothing. He simply took her arm and led her back to the shed. Inside, Grace and Ruth slept beside the stove. 2 small faces turned toward each other in the firelight. Evelyn sat beside them and rested one hand on the blanket. For a long time, she didn't move. 6 days later, the Calhoun plantation records appeared in the Mason County Courthouse. No one knew who delivered them, but the ledger was enough. Silas Calhoun's reputation collapsed. Investigations followed. Debts surfaced. Within a few years, the plantation was gone. The man who once claimed no slave had ever escaped him, died ruined and forgotten. As for Evelyn Harper, 3 weeks later she reached Cincinnati with Grace and Ruth beside her. Both girls registered for the first time in a free state. Grace Freeman, Ruth Freeman. She took Isaiah's surname deliberately, because freedom deserved a name that belonged to it. Evelyn lived long enough to see the Emancipation Proclamation signed in 1863. She was 48 years old, both daughters standing beside her. Free women who had been born into chains and carried across a frozen river before they were even 1 day old. Silas Calhoun believed a woman with nothing left to lose had nothing left to fight with. He was wrong, completely, and far too late to matter.